Thank you very much, and also thank you to Stop It Now for inviting me along to discuss this really important issue, and also one that's quite close to my own heart. As I kind of try to bring to this presentation in terms of on this topic, both around practice kind of reflections, which I think is so important, but also I suppose my own kind of lived experience as a gay male, and some of that I suppose that's influenced my practice over the years as well. So as we mentioned, the first point I suppose to make is in terms of we are going to be focusing just due to time and things really on males in this presentation. There's a number of reasons for that. I think that's also a really important area to concentrate on. So as we've talked a lot about today in terms of males and also some of the data indicating the kind of, as we know, the kind of males are more predominantly the individuals that cause the harm. I think it's so important that we don't forget that also males can be victims, and also some of the factors that perhaps influence individuals for instigating and causing harm as well. I think these are all really important areas to think about. Just move my slide on. So one of the first bits I really wanted to touch on was in terms of really quite basic sexual development, and I suppose factors to consider within gay males, I think is really, really important. One of the things that always comes to my mind on this is the very basic stuff, such as family interactions and discussions, and including that also peer interactions. So what we mean by that is in terms of what does in a family dynamic, what first of all does it actually look like or mean to be gay? And I think that's really important, because first of all, what that tells us, that can start to influence, I suppose, lots of different opportunities, but it can also start to limit opportunities. So if it isn't potentially the most supportive environment for someone to be gay or feel safe to be gay in, immediately that can cause some issues. That can also start to filter in when we start to discuss areas such as peer interactions. And also some of the things around that is within a certain age group, we start to seek kind of information from peers. We start to discuss sexual interest with peers, and actually in that instance, it might not always be something that's available to somebody who is gay. So within that peer situation, they might not have the same opportunity to discuss what their sexual attractions are, and also to be able to explore some of that in a really healthy way, and also have access to healthy sexual experiences that we would hope our young people would be able to get. That also can limit ability to ask questions, so questions really that are relevant to themselves, and also questions that give them answers in terms of their own body, but also their own interests and attractions. And one of the points I think is really important is what Claire touched on earlier in terms of sex education. Yeah, there are some fantastic resources, and I would say particularly in Scotland, there's some phenomenal resources available, but they are, at some instances, inconsistently delivered, and also not always do we explore every single element to these resources that are available within certain education settings. We still, reflecting back in terms of practice, we still see, and I still had an experience of a school actually making a referral for a young gay person to get bespoke sex education. That was for one reason, was really in terms of what we looked at in Simon's work around kind of one instance of inappropriate behaviour that was witnessed. But actually, what concerned me really in that instance was that individual had then been referred to a service who was known for working with child sexual abuse, exploitation and harmful sexual behaviour. But ultimately that referral was made to educate that child on sex. So that to me really struck something, and also kind of opened up the discussion and debate in terms of how do we make sex education inclusive but also meaningful. And I think again what Claire mentioned in terms of the emotional aspect of sex education, I think that's something we really need to promote and push wherever possible. The other one as well kind of turns back to family interactions and discussions, so around kind of gender role modelling. And what we mean by this is also, in this example, is what does it mean to be male within that family dynamic? So in that home, is it very much that there's flexibility within gender, or is it there's an expectation of gender? So what that male has to look like, what that male has to be in that family home, and is that expectation something that doesn't necessarily support that child's development? And that, I suppose, kind of touches in terms of sexual informants when we start to think what is available for the young person to inform them about their sexuality, their sexual interest, and allow them to take some of these factors forward. So these are just a handful of areas that I would argue at times potentially can push young people to go into online communication and also to seek information online via pornography, for example, but also onto other chat forums, which we're just about to touch on. I've used this as an example, and you'll see I've kind of called it exposure, and I've done that for, I suppose, a really important reason. As you can see, first of all, that I've pulled something here that I find really interesting. So the Journal of Adolescent Health took a survey of 200 sexually active teenage boys from ages 14 to 17 and found that more than 50% of them said they use Grindr and other hookup apps for more than just sex. And you can see one of the kind of comments there was, we found that teens in this study were super excited that somebody was paying attention with what was going on in their lives and how these apps played a role in their sexual development and coming out process. Now, if we see those numbers, so first of all, if we consider pornography, there's pornography being talked about in various areas today. But the thing in terms of pornography is pornography can always become a kind of tool, an unhelpful one, but a tool to educate and to self-educate, because at times there isn't the same availability there to be able to learn and to understand different factors. The issue that we obviously have with pornography is, although it may be that that young person can start to explore their sexual interest and start to be able to have that availability, the issue there being is obviously it doesn't give enough expression in terms of intimacy, emotion, and also importantly, consent. The other one that we see, so as you can see within the kind of adolescence health survey, was about online chat rooms, and one of them, the most kind of mainstream, being Grindr. And there's a high percentage there that we can see in terms of young people potentially going on to Grindr. And if you think, and I suppose I think in terms of my own experience growing up, if you had this resource available to you at that time, where you were really seeking romance, where you were really seeking intimacy, and you're at your sexual prime of development, it's so appealing to young people to access such resources. You can see why that happens. The issue, again, that we've mentioned there is obviously 50% say they use Grindr other more than just sex. But the issue is when we go onto these apps immediately, we're hit with words that potentially we've never been exposed to, and we're hit with a very heavily kind of sexually dominated world. You can see some of the screenshots there available on the screen, and these are just kind of, again, a handful of terms that you can see that are coming up immediately on the very first page that a young person potentially signs up to these things. So you can see there's a lot there in terms of dom, including kind of dominance. There's reference to bareback sex, so unprotected sex. There's all these things immediately that are coming up that are starting to listen. And as a young person, I was thinking about that kind of really interested and sponge-like mind where they pull everything in, they want to hear about everything, learn about everything. And this is ultimately something that's been really suppressed. This is now an opportunity to really explore their sexuality. And we can see potentially links to why that can lead into issues of kind of being complex. I think what's also really important is not just to consider how that can influence technology-assisted harmful sexual behaviour, but also how that can influence a young person, a young male, being exploited online. And these are some of the things that we see again in terms of, for example, Grindr. There's an immediate vulnerability there when we see young people going onto these apps who are desperately seeking conversation and looking for someone to simply talk to them about how they feel and what sexually motivates them. That doesn't necessarily mean that's dirty chat. As you can see, some of the terms that are used, that's somebody actually just wanting to understand about their own education, their own body, and why they feel the way they feel. So I think these are really strong themes that we really have to consider. Also within the bottom, you can see the second kind of box there as well. which also links into so many different themes. And as Stuart earlier mentioned, in terms of the messaging that pornography can give, even right away, taking that into dating apps and chatting forums, immediately you can see some of the terms that are really, really unhelpful and potentially quite dangerous to children and young people. The other thing as well is, although these apps are actually obviously designed for 18 and over, it doesn't take very much, as we all know, for young people to be able to access things they shouldn't. In terms of kind of harmful sexual behaviour, for me, that I just wanted to pull some kind of practice considerations that I personally found helpful when supporting this group. One of the ones was consideration given to psychosexual histories and sexual informants, as we've touched on briefly, but also really about understanding the child as being a sexual being with sexual interests, which I think sometimes we fail to see. And by this, I mean allowing the young person the opportunity to simply discuss sexual interest. So during any intervention, I think that's something that's really important, is to actually start to understand and provide the opportunity for the young person to ask questions in terms of what they want to know about, because potentially some of the behaviour may be linked to an individual accessing content that's then pulled them into other cycles that could have potentially been avoided or prevented by better kind of support mechanisms in place. Separate, the other bit of praise, separate sexual behaviour from sexual identity, and I think this is really important. There's a really interesting book by Gary Wilson, which is Your Brain on Porn, and it talks a lot about young people in particular becoming interested or accessing or viewing content that actually doesn't relate to their sexual interest or attraction or identity. So it's that consistent exposure to material, and I suppose that exploration of material. So it's about how we define what someone's sexual behavior is, opposed to what they really are as a sexual being, because we know porn's artificial, for example, and we know that at times that these things that people access doesn't necessarily represent them as a person. Consider the wider factors of the young person's life and not just the sexual behavior. I think this is incredibly important, especially when we start to think, as we talked about earlier, about families and how important the part that families play within this situation. I've written here as well the careful risk assessment to ensure the reported sexual behaviour of the young person has not been inaccurately identified. What we do know is, in terms of boys, are more likely to be referred to harmful sexual behaviour services, and that is again often either through a criminal justice referral route, again, or because they've been charged. So it's really important, though, even in those situations, to really understand how this started and whether or not there is, like we say, forms of victimisation that haven't been identified at this point. The other point as well is, like I said, is family and peer support. Really thinking about that. And we, in this kind of, I suppose in this term, in this day and age, we almost think that everyone's so accepting and everyone's so welcoming to all different individuals and different ideas. But one of the themes that we did see, and I still remember it, and I suppose it was something that I'll never forget, was a young person coming to support with the young person's mum, where they asked me, they stated that they say they're gay, but they can't possibly be gay, and that's why we've brought them here. I found that extremely disturbing, that in this day and age we're still having these conversations about young people in terms of that we believe that this is a choice, and where obviously we absolutely know that isn't the case. But don't automatically assume that is a supported area of this young person's life, and that's really where it comes to the wider kind of assessment to determine what supports are available, and what we need to also support and work on. My last slide, again, I've just pulled 4 points just to really make, because it is a particularly big subject that we could talk a lot about, never mind in 15 minutes. Prevention support. Some of the themes I've looked at was inclusive sex education that includes the online world and emotional aspects of sex and sexuality. Awareness raising within a range of communities to ensure males are considered as victims of online and offline exploitation. And again, supporting a number of males and females, But I think what's important is when we start to work with young males, particularly that are displaying harmful sexual behaviour, we have to really understand the wider factors and dynamics that have potentially influenced certain behaviours. One of the comments as well I've made is additional funding, but also I'd like to say is longer term funding for third sector organisations to provide child-centred interventions for young LGBTQI people. That would also again feed really into supporting parents and carers, which I think is incredibly helpful. So how do we link these services to support parents and carers also? I think that's me just over time, so I'm going to stop there. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to email me or put them in the chat box. Thank you.